to our fifth and last, sadly, session of our Solidarity Dialogues. Today we have Tegye, Birey, and Ewa Maczynska, who are going to be talking about Migrant Solidarities, and they will have their dialogue for 45 minutes or so. And as we've been doing this in the past, after that, we'll open it up for a kind of multi-log, let's call it, questions, which I will be fielding, and the chat will be open the whole time. So you can type any questions or comments in the chat. Now I'm going to read the bios of our new friends because I haven't had time to memorize this myself. So bear with me. Usually I don't read things, but it's called for in this case. Tegye Birey. Tegye has a bachelor's degree in women's studies and political science with a minor in French studies from the University of New Hampshire and a master's degree in gender and social policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has worked in the field of refugee rights and engaged in gender research and training, and has been part of feminist, queer, anti-militarist, and anti-racist activist networks in Cyprus and transnationally. Tegye's current doctoral research examines the intersectional politics of migrants and solidarity networks in Malmö, Sweden, and her research interests are migration, post-colonial, decolonial, feminisms, and politics of resistance. Ewa Maczynska has an MA in International Relations and History from Collegium Civitas and West Virginia University, and a PhD in International Relations from Central European University. In her PhD dissertation, she examined political subjectivities of EU activists supporting migrants and other marginalized groups through horizontal solidarity projects. She was primarily interested in the relationship between one of the contemporary expressions of Western critical, liberatory, counter-hegemonic political thought and the hegemonic discourses of neoliberal capitalism. Her research is based on a series of fieldworks conducted in Denmark, Hungary, and Sweden. So thank you so much, and let's start.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and maybe I will shortly start with introducing my research topic, and then we will continue with Tegye with a conversation about our projects. So, as you've already mentioned, in my PhD dissertation, I studied political imaginaries of European Union activists who came in solidarity with migrants, through what is often seen by activists and scholars as progressive, inclusionary, equality-oriented response to migration, and which I call in my dissertation, following scholars and activists themselves, as horizontal solidarity initiatives. And I studied those initiatives in the years 2015, 2017 in Denmark, Hungary, and Sweden. And I only focused in my dissertation on activists who had a European Union passport and who did not have the experience of migration. And with this particular focus, I wanted to say something about the subjectivity of Western activists who are united around one of the contemporary Western critical social justice-oriented thought. And my main focus was to understand the relationship between activist social justice-oriented anti-systemic counter-hegemonic stance and the broader discourse, hegemonic discourses, primarily the discourses of neoliberal capitalism, in which the activists were both embedded and relatively privileged within. And in the dissertation, I showed that activist narratives reveal a series of entanglements between counter-hegemonic and hegemonic discourses, and more specifically, they showed series of continuities, slippages, and dynamics of neutralization between activist critical stance and the discourses of neoliberal capitalism. So this is a very short introduction, and now maybe Tegye would like to say what was Tegye's research about.
Yes, so hello everyone. I also want to thank you for being here. I know this is one of the last seminars and you're coming to the end of the school, so thank you for still attending. Just to say a couple of things about my research, I focused on the gendered politics of migration activism. And for this, I bring post-colonial, decolonial, and Black feminist theory in conversation with critical citizenship and autonomous migration literatures, which have focused on the analysis of activism with and by migrants in the last couple of decades. And the main contribution of my research is the idea that migrant solidarity initiatives should be approached as a manifestation of relational solidarity rather than being seen as either horizontal or vertical formations. I elaborate on this idea with three foci, which are the intersectionality of asylum politics. Secondly, activism as a form of social reproduction, and the centrality of sociality to migration activism. So today I will mainly be referring to this last focus on sociality, which I discuss through the politics of friendship. And as you can see, Ewa and I both studied solidarity initiatives in similar times and places, but we never actually had a chance to discuss the similarities and the differences between our findings, even though we are close friends as well. So this is our opportunity. So yeah, it's an interesting occasion for us to think about our research projects, how they challenge each other, how they supplement each other. And we are also, of course, looking forward to hearing your feedback and your comments.
And in today's conversation, we decided to narrow down our conversation to one primary topic, which is friendship and affect in solidarity movements. And we decided to take this focus for two main reasons. First of all, we both, throughout our field works, came to realize that friendship, proximity, affect, and we both conceptualize them a bit differently, were crucial elements of activist political project, as well as our own methodological and conceptual tools as researchers. So it became interesting for us to understand how it has been used in our research and in the field work. And secondly, we think that the topic of friendship shows particularly clearly the differences between our approaches and the ways in those differences influence our findings. So maybe before we go into the discussion about those differences, it's important that we also introduce what motivated us to do our research on solidarity activism and talk a bit more broadly about our researches.
Okay, so a bit of a background to how I started thinking about this project. And I started actually drafting the proposal for this research in the autumn of 2015. And as you may remember, this was a period when both migration to Europe and the civilian efforts to welcome refugees to Europe accelerated and gained visibility in the media. A day would not pass without reports about European volunteers who would distribute food, facilitate transportation, and open their houses to refugees, primarily escaping the war in Syria. At this time, I was working as a part-time communications officer at the Refugee Rights Association in the northern part of Cyprus, which is where I'm also from. And I was using the rest of my time left from my part-time employment as an activist of the organization, doing things that were sort of closer to my heart than, doing things like writing reports and so on. And in hindsight, I think I was actually trying to establish friendships with migrants by doing things like going to the beach together or doing music together and so on. But however, over the years, I started actually having some difficulties aligning my ongoing feminist activism with my work at the Refugee Rights Association. I remember having discussions with my colleagues whether we should mobilize refugee women to attend the Women's March in a context where it was banned for non-citizens to attend demonstrations. I also found myself attending TV shows where I stress how super vulnerable refugee women and children are, in line with more, official lines of institutions like UNHCR. Similarly, the social worker thought twice about arranging an abortion for a refugee woman because husband's permission was required to get abortion, and this husband didn't know. And lastly, for example, the lawyer of the association was, citing the backwardness of certain regions in the world in terms of gender equality to be able to stop deportations, to be able to get emergency orders to stop deportations from the court, for instance. And this was quite different from our feminist activism that was not, related to refugee rights. So within that context, I felt the growing urge to take the time and space to reflect further on the gender politics of migration solidarity. And as a result, I conducted a 13-month-long ethnography of migration activism in Malmö, Sweden, with several organizations that were part of the asylum movement. And my main argument about friendship is that it was a contested terrain in migration solidarity. In the asylum movement, people would often refer to each other as friends, and just like comrades, maybe, or similar to comrades in the leftist circles. And friendships established between migrants and resident activists were a significant aspect of solidarity, given the social isolation imposed on newcomers by the migration regime. For instance, they would be forced to live in isolated spaces such as reception and detention centers that were located far away from the urban centers. For many newcomers, sustaining contacts with the local activists as well as other newcomers in the asylum movement was the only way to find community in Sweden. These friendships also had practical implications. Many newcomers, for instance, lived in the houses of activists, which show that friendships in this context also had a redistributive function. Moreover, and maybe most importantly, these relations also deviated from the Western understanding of friendship as intimate interpersonal relationships between people sharing similarities. They took place between people with considerable differences and positionalities. They were long or short term, intimate or not, and most importantly, these interpersonal relationships were also translated to the political discourse of the movement. For instance, there was a campaign called "Do Not Deport My Friend," as part of which the local activists attempted to stop deportations of refugees whom they never met before. And with this, they essentially emphasized the embeddedness of refugees in the Swedish society. And I think they frame via this language deportations as a problem affecting the society as a whole and not only the deportees. And looking at the asylum movement from the perspective of sociality and friendship also for me enabled an investigation of the political life of affect. For instance, the Swedish state also used the framework of friendship, but by promoting relations between citizens and registered asylum seekers and refugees only, of course, excluding people without documents, and mostly funding apolitical feel-good activities, such as going to the concerts, and so on. And I argue in the dissertation that such integration projects primarily aim to address the unease of the white Swedish population about the presence of refugees in the country. And at the same time, affect was evident and significant within the relations of solidarity itself. Local activists, for instance, expressed feelings of guilt and shame about the privileges, their privileges, when they were challenged or criticized by the newcomers, or when they temporarily or permanently left the asylum movement due to burnout. I think Ewa can speak more to this point because she specifically focused on the European activist perceptions and experiences of solidarity. Rather, my point here relates to the affective agency of newcomers in the asylum movement and the need to approach political agency via affect. So refugees are usually expected to perform gratefulness once they receive state protection. And in my research, I found that this dynamic was sometimes also reproduced in the asylum movement. So the activists would actually sort of expect this performance of gratefulness for supporting, for being in solidarity with the migrants. And this, of course, limited the possibilities of newcomers to shape the terms of relations of solidarity they were part of. And for the most part, their criticisms or expressions of anger when faced with things like racism or transphobia in the asylum movement were disregarded or even sometimes pathologized as a result of mental illness, for instance, which led to their exclusion from the movement as well. And this showed that the framework of citizenship sort of presupposed an affectively positive relationship and did not leave much space for contestation. And also one other limitation of using friendship as a marker of solidarity was the fact that it made the lack of solidarity between some groups of newcomers invisible. For instance, there were several cases of classism and racism within different groups of newcomers, which were either triggered or aggravated by the migration regime and the hierarchies it created between asylum seekers, depending on where they were coming from, right, to Sweden. For instance, while any Syrian would be automatically given residency in Sweden between 2013 and 19, others, such as Palestinians, were living in the country without papers for years, which created feelings of resentment and closed the possibility of solidarity between such groups. And this to me showed that there's a need to understand coalitions in a way that goes beyond the idea of liking each other or getting along with each other and seeing them as survival strategies, as actually originally conceptualized by Black feminists in the 80s. So I will stop here and maybe Ewa, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you, Tegye.
Okay.
As Tegye already mentioned, I approached the question of friendship and affect in solidarity movement from different perspectives. And I think as much as Tegye focused primarily on analyzing how friendship and affect, what was its role for the newcomers, I was mostly interested in the way it was mobilized by European Union solidarity activists. And I developed this focus over time. I initially wanted to conduct research on the experiences of LGBTQ asylum seekers in European Union. And in order to be able to reach those asylum seekers, I contacted a group of horizontal solidarity activists based in Denmark. And I picked this particular group because I saw their political and ethical stance as closely aligned with my own. The group was openly critical of states' exclusionary border regime, humanitarian responses to migration, but also of capitalism and its production of social inequalities. And the group also wanted to establish a more equality-oriented relationship with migrants and to challenge the existing structures of power and hierarchies. And one of the important ways in which activists wanted to do it was through developing both physical and emotional closeness with the migrants. And they were invested in establishing dialogue with migrants, forming a sense of togetherness, often in mundane practices, creating collaborative projects, establishing friendship, and carrying with casual encounters. And on the one hand, activists argued that thanks to this closeness, they could connect to migrant-situated knowledges and experiences, and this in turn allowed them to challenge the hegemonic state-centric representations and governance of the migrants. So in this sense, closeness with migrants was seen as an anti-systemic counter-hegemonic practice. And on the other hand, they presented closeness with migrants as affirmative. And for example, establishing friendship between activists and the migrants was often seen by the activists as a way of putting in practice the vision of a more inclusionary and equality-oriented social and political project that they had in mind. So Horizontal Solidarity were clearly pursuing anti-systemic counter-hegemonic project. And at the same time, the majority of Solidarity activists that I encountered, who oftentimes formed the core of Solidarity projects, were people who were actually quite privileged within the global and local structures of power that they came to criticize. They were European Union citizens, they had high level of social capital, they were mobile subjects, they oftentimes came from middle or sometimes upper classes of their societies, and all of them belong to what I conceptualized in my dissertation as global middle class. So while they were critical of structures of power, at the same time, they were quite privileged by those structures. And I was curious to understand the dynamics of such positioning. And I was particularly interested to understand why establishing proximity with migrants played such a crucial role in activist projects. Why was it so important for activists to talk to the migrants, to spend time with migrants, to become friends with migrants? What was it necessary for it? Therefore, I started and kept on interviewing activists in order to understand what they imagined as their counter-hegemonic project, what they paid importance to, and how they explained the need for proximity and friendship. And what I came to realize is that activist narratives simultaneously carried both counter-hegemonic potential and were embedded in and were reproducing hegemonic discourses of neoliberal capitalism. And one of my arguments was that activist emphasis on developing personal proximity and friendship with migrants was one of the important expressions of a broader characteristics of activist political project, namely the centering of the project on the individual self, her actions, her individual responses, and her abilities. And activists focus on the self as one of the primary sites of political action was closely connected with activists' reluctance towards formal politics and the state, which they often saw as producing and reproducing violence and hierarchies between different categories of people. So as an act of counter-hegemonic struggle, activists decided to not participate in any way in state structures and formal politics, even though, as I show in this dissertation, because of their positioning in the structures of power, they were actually very much supported oftentimes by the state that they claim not to engage with. And while this was intended as an anti-systemic position, the reluctance towards the state and the importance of individual in activist project was also in line with the discourses of neoliberal capitalism. For neoliberal capitalism, the state and formal politics are institutions that can limit the flow and the accumulation of capital and connected with it exploitation of labor. So weakening the role of the state and strengthening the importance of individual is one of the crucial elements of neoliberal capitalism, as it limits the possibility of developing collective struggles that could challenge capital accumulation. And I suggest that the importance activists placed on developing personal relationships with migrants was one of the expression of such focus on individualism. It had consequences both on the macro and on the micro level. And on the macro level, as I already said, activists focus on the self, and the distrust towards formal politics was in line with neoliberal privileging of the self and the weakening of collective struggles. But I think it's also very important what they did on the micro level. And first of all, when activists were explaining why it's important for them to develop closeness with migrants, alongside stating that it's important in order to challenge the hegemonic representation of migrants, they also very often stated egoistic reasons. They said that they came close to migrants because they wanted to learn something new, because they wanted to challenge their own comfort zone, because they wanted to experience a more communal way of living or an actual political struggle. And in that sense, proximity with migrants was connected with activist narratives of self-development. Proximity with migrants was also often presented by the activists as indicative of activists' knowledge about migration-related issues, which in turn was oftentimes later utilized in activist professional and or academic life. So proximity with migrants often translated into social and informational capital and served for the activists as a way of personal development. Secondly, the importance of personal closeness between activists and migrants put activists in front of almost an impossible task of unmaking the structures of power in one's individual life. And I argued that this, when I listened to activist narratives, it led to two situations. On one hand, to this kind of megalomaniac fantasy of a Western self that is able to unmake the structures of power purely out of her good intentions in personal relations with people, on one hand, and on the other hand, it led activists to the feeling of burnouts and failure, which in turn oftentimes resulted with temporal suspension or complete withdrawal from activism. And this withdrawal was often negotiated by the activists through the language of self-care. So paradoxically, the proximity with the migrants, the emotional and physical closeness developed as a crucial element of political struggle, was often also presented as the reason for the discontinuity of the project. And at the same time, the knowledge and the experiences that were gained through the experience with the migrants and were translated into social and information capitals that activists had remained with the activists. And it is important to say that I do not say all these things in order to claim that activism was simply a profitable project that activists used to advance their socioeconomic position, or not to in any way question activists' intentions. Rather, it is to actually trace the ways in which neoliberal capitalism is actually able to incorporate its critique and reproduce itself also through those projects that claim to be critical. And what I want to argue is that activist political project, while it was driven by those counter-hegemonic investments, was constructed around series of imaginaries that in themselves did not pose sufficient challenge to the hegemonic discourses and to activists' own positioning as hegemonic subjects. And it is also not to question the individual elements of this project, so the need for dialogue, for example, the critique of power, critique of formal politics, the critique of state, the investment, effective proximity with migrants, the need for friendship and some sort of relationality. Those can be very powerful elements of counter-hegemonic projects, and there is nothing wrong in them as such. But what I was trying to argue in my dissertation is that those elements, when articulated together and when articulated by subjects occupying advanced position within the existing structures of power, were in fact so closely at times in line with the discourses of neoliberal capitalism that they allowed for the neutralization of the otherwise driven by kind of good intention solidarity projects. And yeah, as I said, for me, it was a way of scrutinizing the way in which neoliberalism incorporate its critique into its logic and is also reproduced through projects that are oftentimes critical and also oftentimes critical of neoliberalism. So this is my presentation. And I don't know if how we should proceed right now.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that you question one another, and then we'll open it up to everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay,
If that's okay.
Yep. Maybe we have time for one question each.
We have plenty of time. Don't worry about the time.
Okay. Okay. You worry about the time, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So Ewa, you mentioned that the activists' reluctance to engage with formal structures overlap with the neoliberal ideas of individualism and this self. At the same time, as far as I know, and the anarchist movement and thinking played a big role in the establishment of the asylum movement in Malmö, at least, from 1980s, 1990s. So I was wondering, listening to you, wasn't there maybe also such an undertone to the activist avoidance of the state? Or maybe I can also reframe the question as, do you think anarchism stands a chance in the context of neoliberal capitalism, or all anti-state resistance always already neoliberal and we cannot escape it? So this is my question.
Thank you, Tegye. It's actually a very important question. I by no means want to argue that all the anti-state critiques are by default neoliberal. And of course, there are a lot of initiatives that have quite developed theoretical ideas about how the state could be countered and how different sort of social and political organization could be developed that would not necessarily include nation state. But my experience of talking with migrants and with activists and those activists that formed the solidarity project that I focused on, that were those most newly developed ones, were usually people in their 20s, 30s. And my experience was that majority of those people had anti-capitalist, anti-state stance, but very rarely they actually had a need and ability to unpack what does it actually mean for them in their political project. So what I found out is that oftentimes the statement that someone is anti-capitalist or critical of the state was actually, in fact, a statement of one's disagreement with violence and one's need for a more just society, but it didn't necessarily represent a more systematic, programmatic political engagement. So in this sense, and I think this is what I also kind of in my work identify as this contemporary critical Western type of liberatory thought that I think is very much against violence, but is not necessarily very much embedded in this programmatic reasoning. And I think the reason why it's not just because there's, you know, I don't know, activists are not aware of the possibility of developing this theoretical framework further. I think one of the reasons why this is not present in activist narratives is that I think they have been particularly careful and stressed over not reproducing hierarchies themselves, and not being put in a position or put in a position where they would produce violence. And because of this, I think they were much more prone to be able to criticize something than actually develop structures that would impose or suggest you know, a different form of organization that could be criticized as possibly, you know, creating another form of structures of power. And I think that was also quite interesting. But I definitely agree that there are many, many different ways of thinking about state and violence, and I by no means meant to say that all anti-state initiatives are necessarily doomed to be neoliberalist projects. But I thank you. Thank you for this question. I also have a Tegye question to you, because you said in your presentation that you talked about the idea of relational solidarity, and you also talked about friendship as, I don't remember if you said friendship or the solidarity structures as neither horizontal or vertical. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on this, because I found this very interesting actually.
Okay, let's try. Well, as you mentioned, the mobilizations around migration have been conceptualized as horizontal solidarity initiatives, since they departed from the usual hierarchies of civil society organizations or international organizations or the state. And even though the notion of horizontality can be seen as an ideal that the activists were striving towards, or an ideal that even motivated their practices that address the existing inequalities among activists, in my opinion, it fell short of explaining the complex practices, problems, and the potential of the asylum movement. And borrowing this idea of relationality again from Black feminism as well as the colonial feminism, I argue that relational solidarity is a better term to describe and analyze these mobilizations. Well, my research actually from the beginning was informed, from the stage of research design was informed by this idea of relationality. For instance, I was not interested in only working with refugees or migrants. I did not have a single focus on one organization, and I did not limit my research project to one ethnic group of migrants, for instance. For me, the main object of inquiry was the relations between many different things, relations between differently positioned activists, relations between different organizations and initiatives in the asylum movement, and the relations between the asylum movement and other actors such as the state and the civil society organizations. And I was further interested in the relations between the gender equality regime and the migration regime, actually, in Sweden, and the colonial and racist underpinnings of these regimes. And later on, my ethnographic data confirmed my hypothesis of relational solidarity in several ways. For instance, the asylum movement was far from horizontal when looked from an intersectional lens. while the activists focused on legal status as the primary axis of difference and power in the asylum movement, and consequentially celebrated, for instance, autonomous initiatives by migrants, the fact that women and LGBT migrants were missing from this picture was not generally problematized. So here we can already see that the migration regime that disproportionately penalizes women and LGBT refugees is sort of replicated, in the practices of activists as well. And on the other hand, the crushing majority of the solidarity activists themselves, who were either established migrants in Sweden or who were born and raised in Sweden, all sorts, it's a mixed group of people. They were, I maybe want to say 97% women and queers. Actually, one of my informants, who was a newcomer, said, "Where are the men in Sweden? Because wherever we go, we just see, women at the social services, in the asylum movement. So where are the men in Sweden?" This will stay with me for quite some time, this quote. And I think this also showed, like, looking at migration activism also told me something about Sweden itself and how gender relations, when not regulated, are still quite traditional, right? It's the women and queers, other minorities who are actually doing the social reproduction labor that is left to them. That's a burden put on them, since the state just checked out of providing reception to many of the newcomers during this time. So I think this also connects with your thoughts about neoliberal capitalism. I think the activists were also sort of put in a position of assuming this individualized role, as you also highlighted, because the state was nowhere to be found, and this job was done just like other care work by women in this country. So, okay, therefore, even though notions such as relationality are often approached as enablers of solidarity, right? Like, it has this positive connotations of we are relational, so we can be in solidarity. I think relationality as an analytical concept can also shed light on the broader structural dynamics in which these, relations of solidarity took place. I hope this answered your question.
Yes. I could also generate more questions, but I don't know if maybe we should collect now some questions from.
Yeah.
Let's open it to our participants, and then you can keep asking each other questions, and I also have some questions, but I think the audience probably has. So raise your hand if you have a question, and I will be calling on you, and drop something in the chat as well if you have any responses or questions. And don't be shy, because we know each other already for 2 weeks now, and some of us even longer. Hanna, please, do you want to?
Okay, I have a lot of questions as always. Thank you for your presentation. The first question is that you told about Sweden and about migrants in Sweden, but did you cover other countries as well in your research? Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
I only focused on Sweden, but Ewa actually focused on other countries, so maybe she can take this question.
Yes, I did research in 3 different countries. I did research in Hungary, in Denmark, and in Sweden. I did not necessarily aim to do comparative work on the countries, but of course there's a lot of interesting things that came out from differences between the contexts. But actually what I found out, which I think is quite interesting in terms of the solidarity projects that I studied, is that in all three locations, a big percentage of the activists involved in solidarity struggles were actually international people. So in Hungary, there was a lot of people from Germany, a lot of people from Austria, a lot of people from other European Union countries. The same in Sweden. Actually, there was a lot of German people in all three locations. I would say that Germany was quite an important source of activists. And these people were oftentimes mobile themselves, so they often were in a given place because they studied in this place, and they often had a history of doing solidarity activism or other, not necessarily solidarity, but other forms of activists also in the previous context in which they lived or worked or studied. So in this sense, this is also what one of the things that helped me to think about them in terms of global middle class and not necessarily only representatives of local middle classes, because there was a lot of similarities and connections between those people. There was a lot of similarities and connections, even though those people were coming from different countries and were operating in different context. So it was clearly visible that there is a circulation of ideas and political stands and political thought that is circulating between different contexts and between different people of different nationalities. But I don't know if it answers your question.
I still have some more questions. So another one, yes, thank you for your answer. So I think both of you mentioned that you studied like the state-migrant relation and civil society state-migrant relation in this paradigm. But did you study from the point of international relations?
Could you specify maybe what you mean by this?
Okay, so in my master thesis, I also covered a little bit topic of the migrant crisis on the border of Belarus and Poland, and how Belarus used actually migrants as a tactics of gray zone warfare, like hybrid war. So I was interested if you covered this topic as well. Like not the internal relations between, for example, society and migrants and the state, but yes, like in the paradigm of the conflict and the usage of like hybrid warfare.
I mean, I cannot answer for myself. This was not. Yeah, I understood you. This was not the focus of my work. I was interested in different aspects of migration-related dynamics, but I think for me, and I guess for Tegye as well, this is also like information that you read as, background knowledge. So it's not like we were completely unaware of this also being one of the dimensions of migration-related whatever activism structures problems, but this was not the focus of my dissertation.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe, I mean, it also was not my focus, but it reminded me the example that you gave about the Belarus-Polish border, that a similar blame game, or depends from where you look at it, right, is also taking place between Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus right now, right? Because a lot of migrants from Turkey are traveling to northern part of Cyprus and just crossing the Green Line in Cyprus to apply for asylum in the Republic of Cyprus. And this is like something that Republic of Cyprus is also complaining about. You know, Turkey is instrumentalizing refugees to change the demographics in the island. So it's interesting that this is becoming a trend. It started with Belarus, but this discourse is also traveling to other places right now. And it will be interesting to see what it does, because I mean, these strategies can also look similar, you know, but it may not be the actual same thing, but these discourses are nevertheless reproduced, you know. So now it's in our agenda, this issue as well. So we will wait and see, I guess, how it develops and how broad this discourse gets. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting because as I compared, the Cyprus is also a kind of a gray zone in this situation. And I also know one researcher, she's from Donetsk, and she was doing research and describing like this gray zone between the US and Russia, and the situation with passports, like in the Cyprus with Turkey, they have the same problem in Ukraine with Russia. Yes, it's interesting. Maybe you can recommend me some literature to read.
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me remind people at this point that on the materials page, there's a lot of information already, articles, and I think some books by the people who have taken part in the Solidarity dialogues. And I had a hard time finding it. It's under the academic materials page, but there's a special place for these dialogues. So you'll find everything there. So Mikol, I don't know the pronunciation.
Mikol. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting. What I wanted to ask is if you have looked maybe into this dynamic of, you mentioned some sort of opposition between activism and the structures of power. So the tendency of activists to be against, in some way, the structures of power. But what I was wondering is if you have maybe seen differences in cooperation with structures of power, depending on the dimension of the city or town. Where is this coming from? So I'm Italian. In 2015, you know, there was this refugee crisis, and, you know, Italy was one of the gateways to Europe. And at some point, immigrants started to be relocated from Lampedusa and Sicily to other parts of Italy. And I come from a relatively small place, 5,000 people live there. And when 40 migrants were relocated, you have to see that 40 people in a village is a big number. What I actually experienced was an amazing cooperation between activists and structures of power, because nobody knew what they were doing. So what I was wondering is it something that is specific to my village, or is it something that you saw elsewhere as well?
Can I take this, Ewa?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually saw a bunch of different strategies about this, and there was actually a lot of tension between different organizations. having different strategies, and a lot of public discussions about this. One example was Refugees Welcome Sweden, which sort of was revived or founded right at this moment in 2015, because the Swedish Migration Agency was basically saying, we don't have the capacity to house these people, therefore, like, we're not gonna do anything. And then this initiative sort of stepped up and devised this, I think it was an app or a website where they would match locals with refugees. And they very closely cooperated actually with the state and the migration agency to coordinate this. And then there were, as I was saying, more like extra parliamentarian, anarchist tendency groups who are definitely against doing the job of the state without criticizing the state. So I think this is an ongoing tension. I know also in Denmark, this division between practical solidarity and political solidarity. And in the mind of the activists, there is a hierarchy, right? Like practical solidarity is more like humanitarianism, it's more like charity, it's apolitical, whereas campaigning and demonstrations, these are more high in the hierarchy. But I think these divisions are also changing. And I think it will also affect the relationships, or like further change the relationships with the state. And in general in Sweden, the civil society is very much connected to the state through funding, through states monitoring. So there is this trend already, and it's getting a bit more, and you know, some small groups are resisting it, but I don't think we can say it for all of the activists in this movement in all of the country. So I don't think it's something specific to your village. Thank you.
But I wanted to say to this as well, that it is actually very interesting. The question is in general very interesting, because even for those activists who, you know, position themselves as clearly unwilling to participate with state, to work, collaborate with state or with more institutionalized sphere of NGOs. Even with those activists, you can clearly see how their relationship with state changes depending exactly on the context in which they operate. And for example, when you compare Hungary with Sweden and with Denmark, you can see that even the amount of resources that the activists are able to gather is very, very different, because in Denmark and in Sweden, which are much more prosperous countries, citizens, for example, often give donations that are of quality and quantity that are not ever possible to receive in Hungary, right? Or there are practices of dumpster diving, very popular, for example, in Denmark, where you can actually collect very good quality food from supermarkets. This is not possible in Hungary because of the, you know, quality of the wealth of the country, or lack of the wealth. And for example, in the activists in Hungary, they were also saying they were very, very critical of humanitarian discourses, very critical of state discourses, but they were openly saying that because, and a lot of them were from, as I said, from Germany, from Austria, and those people said that in Hungary, they have to actually do the type of rhetoric that they would never like to engage in their home countries, but they have to do it because in their home countries, there are other institutions who do it, right? So they're already in Sweden, in Denmark, in Germany, there are institutions, there are NGOs who say migrants are not bad people, right? It's a very like problematic statement if you are more critical, but it's this very like liberal type of statement where all people, migrants are not bad people. In Hungary, this sort of rhetoric is not existing that much. So these people who would be normally critical of this sort of narrative had to produce those narratives in order to somewhat advance the cause of the migrants. So yes, I think it very, very, very much differs from the places, depending on the places.
Thank you very much for your answer.
I would like to jump in here and read a comment. Anna T. Thank you both for your input and sharing of experiences and ideas. Tegye, I was thinking of Sarah Ahmed's melancholic migrant figure when you talked about people being pathologized for calling out racism and transphobia. For Ahmed, the melancholic migrant is the one that refuses to let go of what has been left behind and calls out racism, as opposed to the migrant that has been assimilated and embraced their new society, aspiring for individualism. I wondered how you thought about these moments of pathologization and individualization of the problem. I guess that's for either one of you.
I think it's for Tegye, no?
Oh, maybe for Tegye, yes, yes, yes.
I mean, I actually use melancholy in a related but different way in the dissertation. I refer to Paul Gilroy's use of melancholy for colonialism. So how, certain countries are grieving this loss of empire, and how in Nordic countries, this actually becomes a bit more complicated because their relationship to colonialism maybe was not that standard, but they were very much involved in slave trade and colonialism as well. So, this melancholia of the past power, this is how I actually think to use this concept in the dissertation. I did not think about Sarah Ahmed's use of the term with the migrant, but I think it overlaps perfectly, with the melancholia of the state and the population versus the melancholia of the migrant, connected by, these ties of racism and, on the one hand, they need to deny it and not talk about it, and on the other hand, this melancholia does not want to talk about it. So, the state does not want to talk about it, society doesn't want to talk about it. On the other hand, the migrant does want to, all mediated by melancholia, right? So thank you for this comment. I mean, of course, what I think about this cases of pathologization and individualization of the problem, of course, it is extremely, extremely problematic. It connects to, what Ewa was saying, how activism becomes about the self and creating this image of the self. Like a lot of the migrants that I interviewed use this term of, oh, they're just trying to be cool people, So there is this resentment that the activists are trying to build their own image. So whenever they get feedback that counters the image that they are trying to build, then this is very core shaking, so they just project this back by saying, by basically asking for a performance of gratefulness and being like, how hard it is to help you and so many others, literally asking for performance of gratefulness. So I think, yeah, this idea of melancholy is actually very interesting. So I am gonna note it down and add it to the chapter. Thank you, Anna.
Are there any other questions or comments?
I would just add, but I'm not a scholar myself, so I'm more of a activist, and I just recently started to volunteer here in Germany, even though I'm originally from Russia. So I'm just interested maybe in some of the practical implications. And on that note of like performance, oh my God, I saw that happening. And well, I know like people from the post-Soviet like countries really well. And I know that they from time to time perform in a different ways, for example, gratefulness. So they can only say thank you. And it will like really mean a lot for them and for you. And you really know that in like these real subtle way, you really know that they're really grateful. But here I noticed that some of the German people, they really need like these big smile, these really, thank you so much. And I thought, okay, maybe we should somehow warn people like from the get-go, okay, do not expect much just because people here are at first, of course, exhausted, traumatized. Third of all, they express emotions in a slightly different way from, for example, Germany. So it can like be really, really different. And maybe you have some other like practical implications you would like to mention. I would love to listen to that.
Thank you, Yelena.
Ewa?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for this comment. Of course, it's a very, I mean, for me, it's also a very interesting comment because I'm from Poland. I also live in Germany. So there's actually a lot of things that I observed and recognize in those differences. And I also try to, you know, come to terms with it. And I don't have any suggestions or any practical implications because, yeah, I just don't have any because I'm still also trying myself to understand what are the actual differences, right? Because I think that's one of the important problems that I think when faced with different sort of expressions and different histories, I think it takes really, really long time to understand what is actually the main difference, right? And where is the problem and what could be talked about differently. So I cannot offer any support, but I can say that I definitely empathize with you with your statement, and yes, that's on my side.
Now I know Ewa will criticize me for making suggestions about interpersonal relations when the problems are structural, but I think one vague thing that I came to realize is a very simple thing. Just, you know, there is nothing that will stay unchanged about the relations, the institutions, the activist rules, the activist expectations once there's an encounter. So I think this is what needs to be understood, that there's no guideline. The guidelines will be co-written in the relationships, right? So I think this is one point, just to be open to surprise and just, you know, just be ready to feel that, you know, you're not enough and it's not a feel-good activity, you know, but then it's really politically necessary. And the rules will be co-written depending on who you are encountering.
Tegye, I support you. I don't criticize.
Okay, good to know.
We can see the way the friendship works here. Thank you. That was Yelena who just made that comment. Mikol has another. Do you want me to read out what you've written, or do you want to read this yourself, Mikol?
I can read it myself.
Yes.
It's not
Okay.
really a question, it's
But
more of like a comment.
It's a good contribution. Please read it. Yeah.
A remark. So what I wanted to say is that I really identify, and I'm somewhat reluctant to admit it, with the description that Ewa provided of the average activist, which is basically a good person that does it with good intentions, but also gets involved for some individualistic and somewhat selfish reasons. Like in my case, I started teaching Italian to migrants in my senior year in high school. And, you know, I really believed that I was doing something important. You know, I had that naive idea, typical of 18 years old, that I could change the world in a way. But I also was doing it for a very practical reason. I was offered extra credit for doing it. So I really identify with that description of, you know, good intentions and individualism mixed together.
Maybe I can answer to this just shortly, because I think that it's really, really important. I mean, what I was trying to say is not to criticize individual people or suggest that there is some sort of pure, you know, possibility of pure unegoistic engagement with the cause. I think what I was rather trying to say is that individual people act in broader structures, and those broader structures influence them, right? And the type of narratives that we have, and what we say to ourselves, and what we say to our other people, and how we explain stuff, and what benefits us and what doesn't benefit us, is a reflection of those broader structures. And I think that if we look at the individual narratives, we can understand how those broader structures shape and support people in pursuing a certain type of path than the other type of path, right? So in this sense, I think the work that I was doing was oftentimes actually possibly perceived by some people as uncomfortable, in a sense that I often talked and presented my work to activists. Rarely anyone identified exactly the activists that I studied, but I think a lot of people felt this sort of discomfort that I'm saying that they could have done something better. And I don't think this is what I was trying to say. I think I was trying to just show how, you know, certain broader structures are being reproduced and how this can be visible in our narratives. And perhaps we can think about the changes that we could make on a structural level, rather than, again, put this like self-disciplining mode on the individual person, where you realize, oh, now that I said that I also want to do it for egoistic reasons, this is bad, so I shouldn't do it, and then keep on, you know, like keeping everything on the level of individual well-disciplined, this time in like critical thinking type of a person. So I just wanted, I don't know if I read your comment well, but I just wanted to say that my you know, intention wasn't to criticize or to dismiss the things that people were doing, even when they were doing it because they wanted something for themselves from this, right? Because yeah, I don't believe in a purity type of possibility in this world.
No, definitely. I wasn't saying that I felt attacked personally. It was just, a remark that, I mean, I realized that it is a reality, and it was a reality for me, that it is impossible to have, I agree, it is impossible to have this pure and absolutely selfless idea. Everybody does things in a way that benefits them somehow. So yeah, it wasn't, maybe I didn't express myself properly, but I wasn't saying I feel attacked.
Okay. Thank you for your comment.
So I see that we have another question from Hanna.
Yes, it's not the question, but it's a comment. If I can, if we still have like some time, can I please say my comment? Okay.
I muted myself. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
If
So,
Tegye and Ewa still have time, are you okay with the?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you again. I just reminded also, like, there is one girl from Russia. She studied migrant situation in Germany and Russia. And it's very interesting, like the concept of us and them, about Russian migrants who came to Germany and then they were back to Russia and they were not the part of community anywhere. They were not part of community in Germany because for Germany, for German people, they were Russians, and for Russian people, they were Germans, came from Germany, even though they had like Russian background. And this also reminded me Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and the song Us and Them. And it's not about migrant concept, but it's about also the groups of people and how they perceive this concept. Thank you so much. You just gave me a lot of insights, and it was inspiring to listen to you. And I hope that you go further with your research and we can hear some more results later. Thank you again.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much.
May I ask one question here? Am I muted? No. I would love to know about your the distinction, if you make a distinction between your your scholarship, your scholarly work, and your activism, and whether they just sort of seamlessly feed one another, or whether you feel some kind of contradiction, that you are unable to fulfill some sort of expectations that you have of yourself, either as an activist or as a scholar. And yeah, that's what I would love to know from both of you.
Well, for me, I actually do not see a contradiction, and I don't see activism and research as in binary terms. I think activists are knowledge producers. Usually activists produce knowledge far faster than academics catch up. The academics that, you know, study them. So I think there are a lot of same processes going on in both spheres of academia and activism. It's just maybe the temporality is a bit different, you know. The time is very going very fast in activism, whereas, you know, in a PhD project like this, I had 6 years to think about one question. So I think I see this also as part of my activist work, just done in a different format, let's say. And, you know, I also, when I was in Sweden doing my field work, it was participatory action research. So I was also volunteering there and, you know, just doing some side research projects for the organizations and trying to contribute to the work that they were doing. So again, like using my research skills to do something for the organization that is not part of my dissertation, for instance. So I think these things really blurred these lines for me. I'm not saying this is definitely not problematic. I'm sure we can find problematic ways about this, but somehow for me, the differentiation didn't really hold in this experience, at least.
Good relationality then. Maybe not friendship, but good relationality at least. Yeah.
Probably my friendships with my informants will be a bit bruised after the dissertation, but
Or strengthened.
Yeah,
or strengthened, yeah. Ewa,
Yes.
I don't know if you have the same experience with.
I mean, I think I agree with what Tegye said. I don't necessarily consider myself to be an activist. I don't have the history of, you know, this very organized activism. I, of course, have some experiences, and also throughout my research, I participated in a lot of activist practices. But I agree with Tegye, I think they both have its pros and cons, and I think they can both produce a very important result and at the same time have their own shortcomings. I think the speed with which the things are produced and the way in which I think activism oftentimes is more focused actually on producing certain outcome, whereas academia, at least this academia that I'm familiar with, is more prone to take things apart and analyze them and see the, you know, problems and tensions, which is extremely important, but perhaps can be criticized as not giving a, you know, a more kind of an idea of what to do otherwise, right? It's more on the side of critique than on the side of production of something new. I think it's best probably if we combine the two and use them in order to support each other.
Mhm. So Hanna has another question.
Yes, I have another small question to both Tegye and Ewa. Maybe if you remember, you can tell me, how did you come up with your research question? What was for you the source of inspiration, or maybe you found some puzzling point in the previous researches? Maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
Tegye, do you want to start? Or
Yeah. Yeah, I briefly talked about this in the beginning, but it was really based on my own migration activism in Cyprus up until 2015. And yeah, I was personally actually not satisfied with, you know, my organization or my own personal handling of you know, issues related to feminism when it comes to refugee rights work. So it really just came from my own personal confusion and frustration. So I think basically, yeah, I'm just trying to make sense of something that was troubling me for a long time. And there was a gap in the literature. So there we go.
But did
yeah,
you?
for me,
Mhm.
no, you can ask the question.
Sorry. So do you feel that you answered your internal question or not?
I think I'm in the process of answering as I'm writing right now. Yeah, so I'll let you know when that happens.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I think for me, it's similar as for Tegye. I also mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. I think it's this moment when you go to fieldwork and you start doing fieldwork and all of a sudden you understand that what you thought you will find and certain assumptions just don't necessarily make sense. And for me, it was this realization where I really went with all this, you know, fantasy of, I'm from international relations. I wanted to do research on queer migrants and their narratives. It's quite a critical approach, challenging the hegemonic narratives in IR, you know, bringing the marginalized voices into the discussion, all these things. And then you come to the field work and all of a sudden you realize that you actually have no idea how to even start comprehending how to narrate and think about experiences of people who come from all those different countries with very different experiences. I just felt very handicapped in terms of my abilities to actually make sense and understand the context and the narratives and the experiences of the people. And upon understanding that I'm incapable of doing this, I started questioning myself and, you know, the people that I identified politically with. What is it that exactly makes us so, you know, driven to go and to have this close contact, right? Like, why is it actually important? Why is it that crucial that we go and travel 6 people, individual people, to the asylum seekers, to the asylum center to talk to the people who are applying for asylum status instead of, for example, I don't know, organizing political campaigns and sending money. And I think I just wanted to understand, yeah, I wanted to understand the type of political projects that I thought I'm close with, and a lot of people I know, I value, I care about, I'm close with, and yet we are observing the world going more and more down the drain. So what's up, no?
Thank you.
I would like to thank all of the questioners, great questions, and then really want to thank both of you, Tegye and Ewa, for your presentations. I'm wrapping it up because it's already an hour and a half, and I think you might be tired. And also we can keep in touch after this via email, or I put your emails in the chat if that's okay. Are you all right with sharing the email?
Yes.
Sure.
And you know, we would love to see you again at the Institute, and personally, I think a number of us would like to continue our multi-log. And I just want to say that I love ending on this note of vulnerability. I think somebody mentioned that, and we've been talking about this a lot in the Institute, and it seems to be a necessary sort of place within solidarity efforts of any kind, right? This acknowledging of vulnerabilities. So yeah, I'm glad about this, and I thank you very much for the, for ending on this note. And yeah, I think that's all for tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you
Yes.
for great moderation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this session.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Bye.